In the sprawling, chaotic world of intergalactic trade, where entire civilizations were bought and sold like commodities, there was a man who had seen it all. His name was Captain Thorn, a seasoned trader and mercenary who had once been a respected soldier in the Earth Federation. After leaving the military, he had traded in everything from weapons to information, and even people. The galaxy was a vast marketplace, and Thorn had become one of its most trusted players, a neutral party that operated in the gray areas of the law. It was on one of these missions that Thorn's life would change forever. The message came through the encrypted transmission late one night, as he stood in the cockpit of his aging freighter, the Pathfinder. The glowing console in front of him hummed with the familiar sound of incoming orders. Captain Thorn, the voice on the other end, crackled. "We have a new acquisition for you. We need you to transport a widow and her child, an alien species called the Zorner. They're worth a pretty sum in the human markets. Your mission is to deliver them to Rail for and sell them to the highest bidder. Your payment will be adjusted based on their condition upon arrival." The transmission ended abruptly, and Thorn was left staring at the glowing screen. The Zorner, a species known for their beauty and high demand in the slave markets. The widow and her child would fetch a high price, no doubt, but something about the order gnawed at him. Thorn wasn't a man without morals, though he had long buried any idealistic notions of right and wrong under layers of hard-earned pragmatism. The galaxy was a brutal place, and survival meant doing things that were often ugly. But the idea of selling a mother and her child, forcing them into a life of slavery, didn't sit well with him. Yet, he had his orders. He was a man of business, not of sentiment. He looked out the viewport at the distant stars, then back at the terminal. The credits, the job, it all beckoned. But something felt wrong. A few days later, Thorn arrived at the coordinates given to him, an isolated moon orbiting the gas giant Arches X. There, he found the Zorner widow. Her name was Lyra, and her child, a young girl named Kael, standing before the docking ramp of a decaying space station. The mother's gaze was distant, hollow, as though she had already accepted her fate. Kael, no more than 7 cycles old, clung to her side, her large dark eyes filled with both curiosity and fear. Lyra's appearance was striking, even for the Zorner, a species known for their luminous skin, long flowing hair, and delicate features. She was draped in a tattered robe, her beauty marred by the exhaustion and grief of her situation. Thorn felt a pang of guilt, but he quickly buried it. He had a job to do. The widow looked up at him as he approached, her voice soft but tinged with the weight of loss. "I understand why you're here, but please don't harm her." Her words were heavy, almost pleading. Thorn remained stoic, stepping forward and offering no words. It was only his job to transport them. The rest was someone else's business. "Come," Thorn said curtly, motioning toward the ship's entryway. Lyra nodded and silently walked up the ramp, Kael holding tightly to her side. They entered the Pathfinder, and as soon as the hatch sealed, Thorn initiated the engines. He watched them from the cockpit as the ship lifted off. Kael's eyes met his for a moment, and there was an innocence in them that made him feel uneasy. He quickly looked away. The journey to Rail took several days, and in that time, Thorn did his best to maintain distance from the two. But he couldn't help but notice the bond between the mother and child. The warmth they shared was palpable, and Kael would often look up at her mother with admiration, as if Lyra was the only thing standing between them and the void of space. Thorn's heart, hardened by years of cruelty and betrayal, began to soften just a little. One evening, as the stars streaked by, Thorn sat in the mess hall, sipping on a bottle of rationed liquor. His mind was clouded, his thoughts racing back to the orders he had received. Sell them. That was the task. But each time he looked at Lyra and Kael, something inside him pushed back against it. He wasn't supposed to care. He was a businessman, a mercenary, a man who had made his living by trading everything from resources to lives. But Lyra's eyes, those eyes that spoke of a lost world, of a mother who had already suffered too much, troubled him deeply. The sound of footsteps on the metal floor interrupted his brooding. Lyra stepped into the mess hall, her eyes cautiously scanning the room. She looked hesitant, but there was a determination about her that caught Thorn off guard. "Captain," she said quietly, her voice still gentle despite the fear that lay beneath it. "I need to ask you something." Thorn set his bottle down, his gaze hardening. "What is it?" Lyra's voice cracked slightly as she continued. "You've been kind. You haven't harmed us. I wanted to thank you for that." She paused, as though weighing something heavy in her mind. "But I beg you, please, don't take us to the slave markets. I'll do anything." Thorn froze. Her words stirred something deep within him. He could see the desperation in her eyes, the fear for her child's future, and something else, a flicker of hope. She wasn't pleading for herself alone. She was begging for Kael's future. Thorn opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the harsh crackle of a transmission filled the air. "Captain Thorn," the voice from the other end was sharp and authoritative. "Do not deviate from your mission. Deliver the Zorner widow and her child to Rael, for as ordered. Failure to comply will result in a significant penalty." Thorn's hand tightened around the bottle. He looked over at Lyra, who had gone pale. Her fear was palpable. The orders were clear, but something within him was changing. The next few days were a blur. Thorn found himself constantly torn between the orders he had been given and the growing sense of empathy that bloomed inside him. He had been raised to believe that survival came first, that there was no room for sentimentality. But as he saw the quiet way Lyra cared for her daughter, the soft whispers of comfort between them, he began to question everything. By the time they reached Rael 4, Thorn had made up his mind. He would not follow through with the sale. Rael 4's markets were as bustling and brutal as Thorn had imagined. The crowded spaceports were filled with the cries of merchants peddling their goods, and in the shadows, the dark underbelly of the slave trade flourished. Thorn set the ship down in a remote docking bay, where he knew agents from various factions would be waiting. But as he stood on the ramp, he turned to Lyra and Kael, and something inside him snapped. He had a choice. He could turn them over, collect his payment, and walk away. Or he could do something he hadn't done in years. He could protect them. Without a word, Thorn walked down the ramp, leaving the agents behind. Lyra's eyes widened, and Kael reached for her. But Thorn was already heading toward a small transport ship, the kind he'd used to escape the system. "What are you doing?" Lyra asked, her voice trembling. "I'm taking you both to safety," Thorn said firmly. "I've made a promise to protect you, and I'm keeping it." As they lifted off into the vast expanse of space, Lyra's hand found Kael's, and a quiet hope began to blossom in their hearts. They were not alone anymore. Thorn, the man who had been ordered to sell them, had become their protector, their family. They would face the challenges of the galaxy together, not as slaves, but as free beings, bound by the shared bond of survival and love.